this person is really, really smart and intelligent, and you're impressed by the breadth of knowledge that the person has. And then you have a second call and you realize he's also very humble, a fantastic person. And by the third call, you become friends with him. Dear all, our next guest is a widely published policy economist, entrepreneur, and commentator. He has advised cabinet ministers as well as sat on Australia's Productivity Commission, bringing innovative solutions to the forefront. We are honored to introduce Professor Nicholas Gruen, founder and CEO of Lateral Economics Australia, who better to tell us whether behavioral insights are the new scientism. Over to you, Nicholas.
Thanks, Prakash. I'll just put this on. I'll just share my screen. Then I have to go into presentation mode, so sing out if anything is wrong about this. We in good shape to speak, Prakash?
Yes, we are. All yours.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk about Are Behavioural Insights the New Scientism? You'll find out what scientism means if you don't know soon enough. And I'm going to illustrate that with a rather cheeky question, which is, what would a real well-being budget look like? So many of you will recall that Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, is associated with the world's first well-being budget. And certainly the idea is a very worthy one, which is to use the instruments of government, not just to look after the economy, but to target the well-being of its population. So this has gone around the world. Jacinta has become a star of the World Economic Forum, the United Nations. She even provoked her own little culture war in Australia, as you can see there on the right, with our Labor Party saying it wasn't a bad idea, and our Conservative Liberal Party making fun of the idea. Now in Australia, well, before I get onto that, I want to make some big grand claims, really. They're audacious claims, and you should be rightly sceptical of them. So it's up to me to demonstrate them to you. That the New Zealand Wellbeing Budget was not really a new approach or a new paradigm. It was a bit of a rebranding. That Jacinta, that's not because Jacinda Ardern is a cynical person, nor even that her bureaucrats were cynical and just managed to pull her by the nose and give her business as usual when she asked for something special. They believe they're delivering a wellbeing budget as well, but they're not. And they're not because of a simple confusion. So that's my audacious claim. So let me start out by telling you that Australia had a wellbeing framework. It was announced by, it was championed by the Secretary of the Treasury, Ken Henry, in I think it was 2011. And the Treasury produced this 5-point wellbeing framework, and some speeches were given about it, and they explained what a great thing it would be, and nothing much happened. Life went on as usual. Some of you might have had similar experiences when you've been off to a weekend retreat, an off-site retreat, and you thrash through lots of mission statements and critical but very general statements, and when you get back it's pretty much all the same. And in fact, just a few years on, with the Australian Wellbeing Framework having apparently found its way into Treasury's DNA, the Treasury produced its own submissions to government inquiries. One was on improving Australia's financial system to meet its evolving needs. The other one was supporting its competition policy framework. And here's the thing, the Treasury submission did not mention the word complexity in those two inquiries, which raised the question of complexity for consumers. Some wellbeing framework. In New Zealand, before Jacinta Ardern arrived, Jacinta Ardern, in fact, met a New Zealand Treasury that had been thinking and talking about wellbeing just as the Australian Treasury had, but it had been doing it in a much more serious way. It had done a good deal of work on this, and I'm just showing you a few graphics from what was a really quite substantial amount of work, and I had some discussions with the New Zealand Treasury during that time. This is the Living Standards Framework, which they claim is the heart of their policy advice. And this is a translation of that framework into the language and concepts of their Indigenous people, the Maori. Here's some further work showing you how they're fitting the various bits of the puzzle together. On the left, on the right, the Treasury is doing some serious work on trying to come to terms with the academic literature, discussing things like social capital, how is it going to be defined, how are we going to operationalise trying to improve it, and so on. So by the time Jacinta Ardern arrived and said she wanted to do wellbeing budgeting, the Prime Minister and or rather the Treasury and their new Prime Minister were well matched. And on the left, you can see a framework that they've developed. I won't pause too much to go into it. On the right, you can see a heat map. Now, let me just explain to you what's going on there. Down here on the bottom left-hand corner, you get well-being dimensions of well-being, if you like. So one is civic engagement and governance, another one is cultural identity, jobs and earnings, and so on, health, education, environment, and so on. And in this heat map, what they're able to do, because they're getting so much data in, is that they can tell you the correlation between housing on the one hand and income and consumption on the other. And that's highly correlated, as you would expect, because people with income get themselves better housing and so on. So the wellbeing budget was put together according to 5 themes, and I'm just putting the 5 themes before you there. And the New Zealand Treasury is able to take quite narrow, this is a fairly broad part of the New Zealand population from 15 to 34 years. They're able to take, but they're able to take much narrower snapshots than that, and they're able to tell you how they're going on all those dimensions. So this is a pretty impressive story. I don't know whether they can tell you the well-being of Indigenous people in Rotorua, but that's the kind of thing that I know they aspire to be able to do. And there's something missing with all this work. There's something missing. There's something terribly missing, because with all that work, we might know a great deal about Maori well-being in Rotorua, how it is better or worse than non-Maori well-being in Rotorua, and we have not got any direct information on how to improve it. So welcome to one of the most classic, one of the most profound and powerful phenomena of scientism, which helps us confuse knowing a lot about something, having a lot of knowledge about something, with knowing what to do next, knowing why we want the information and how we can make the world better for that aspiration. And of course, I can't help but notice that in this conference, having listened to a few sessions, the expression behavioural science is used quite a lot. Now, please don't think I'm therefore critical of behavioural science. Science is important. Knowing what's going on in the world, being rigorous about that is obviously important. But I want to broaden, I want to show you something that I think is really very striking. Here's a guy called Herbert Simon, and he helps us crystallize this distinction between science, scientism, knowing how and knowing what. And one of the things he says is that the sciences are for knowing. And there's a list of sciences, and at the top of that list is the most rigorous, if you like, and the most highly prestigious science, and it goes down to more complicated, more chancy, more uncertain disciplines. And then he adds, then Herbert Simon tells us that the professions are for doing. And there's a list of professions. Now, I can't help, this is a kind of an aside, but it helps me make some of the points I want to make. I think economics is in the wrong list. Not that Herbert Simon has put it in the wrong list. I think it puts itself in the wrong list. I think economics should think of itself as a profession, that is, something which obviously wants to base itself on science where appropriate, but that it should think of itself as a discipline for doing things in the economic world. And I think, and another way to think, and again, I'm not trying to tell you behavioural, I'm not trying to demonise one group of one discipline and lionize another one, but a nice, I think quite a good contrast for the attendance at this conference to think about is the idea of behavioural science as a science and human-centred design. As Herbert Simon said, all professions, all attempts to make the world better are exercises in design. So more generally, scientism involves the reaching for scientific prestige for its own sake, rather than because being scientific is the most important thing that we need to be. Scientism involves trying to look scientific, which economics has a terrible problem with, because most economics is in mathematics, and some of it needs to be in mathematics, but quite a lot of it, in fact, some of the things I'll talk to you today about, sort of can't be put in mathematics. If you put them in mathematics, you can't understand them as well as if you put them in words, and as a result, economists really barely know about them. And scientism tends to deal in decontextualized knowledge nuggets. Sounds like a product, doesn't it? Maybe I should set up a business selling decontextualized knowledge nuggets, but there's a fairly heavily subsidized industry that would be competing with me, academia, so maybe that's not such a good idea. And we've seen the cost of this in the global pandemic. Here's a sort of status map of science, and a good deal of our handling of the global pandemic was scientistic. It was too enamored of scientific respectability. What's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is it wasn't commonsensical enough. Much of it was too decontextualized. Let me give you a very specific example. Here is a hierarchy of evidence that you would learn if you went to medical school, and particularly if you were studying public health and epidemiology. You can see there that meta-analysis, systematic review, randomized controlled trials are the most, they're the most prestigious, most scientific kinds of evidence. The problem is this, it's an okay thing to learn as a sort of proposition, but it comes with a heavy caveat. And the caveat is all other things being equal. And all other things are not equal. If I asked you, how do we decide whether or not parachutes work? You could tell me to do a randomized controlled trial. You could tell me, well, we won't know if they really work or not scientifically if we haven't done a randomized controlled trial. But I don't think you'll be able to get people to agree to do a randomized controlled trial of people jumping out of planes with and without parachutes. So we found ourselves in the global financial crisis in this situation where quite a large number of epidemiologists were saying, we can't use certain bits of evidence because it doesn't come with a high enough pedigree. And as you can see the problem, I think, that there's going to be a lot of evidence that you're going to need to use. And not only is it not going to be as good as you'd like, but you'll be varying certain things, and you may want to use evidence in some slightly new way. And you have to make your own judgments about that. And yet we teach epidemiology, public health, medicine a little too much like it is a science and not a profession, that it's about knowing more than doing. And as a result, our response to COVID was, let's just say, catastrophic. Here are two interventions. One is just taking people's temperature. That can have some effect. Masks, as we know, can have a very substantial effect. The WHO, the highest body, the body at the top, the World Health Organization, said that masks weren't advised, and as a result, the chief medical officers of various countries came out and advised that you really wouldn't want to wear a mask. Here's something I looked at. This slide is about 6 weeks old. I think it would have changed. The actual details would have changed a bit, but not much. So once the COVID crisis was upon us, this was, I think this was in June. The data for this slide. There were, at this point of time, there were 145 drug trials of hydroxychloroquine in various hospitals and hospital systems around the world. As we know, there are scores of vaccine trials, and at that point there had been 2 trials of masks, none examining social distancing, the quarantine effect or adherence, hand hygiene, and other non-drug interventions. Almost no research on the effects of non-drug interventions on transmissibility. Meanwhile, this is a picture of a friend of mine who's a data scientist and was the chief scientist at Kaggle, which was a company that I was the founding chairman of, and is now owned by Google. And he is not an epidemiologist. He's a very smart guy, and he decided to take action. And he and some friends of his in the Czech Republic and elsewhere have saved tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives. And I'll now play you a brief video. Are things functioning now, Prakash? Can you hear me?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, okay. So now some months afterwards, here is the Centre for Disease Control Director saying face masks may provide more protection than coronavirus vaccine. And a shocking admission, and something that tells us we could have saved trillions of dollars in our response to coronavirus. Now, I do want to play another video that's quite important. I'll just have to.
Professor,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. Can you try unplugging your?
Yeah, I'll do that when I get to it. I'll try that.
Maybe that's how the video will work. Yes, sound on that.
Yeah, well, we tried it before. I don't think so. We'll see. Anyway, so I now want to talk about nudge units and what works. And I think it's important to place this in the context of the problem of bureaucracy. So bureaucracies are big and complicated things like markets and lots of other things. They have people at the top of them, and those people in government bureaucracies control policy, and delivery is done further down the organisation. And here's Peter Shergold, who was very senior public servant in Australia for a long time, telling us that government policy, it should be more, making government policy should not be more prestigious than delivering results. And he, unfortunately it was in 2005, it still is now, and I can find you very similar statements to that effect from Canada and the United Kingdom and so on. Now, one thing that I think, and I won't go into this because I don't have time, but I first saw this in the early 1980s, how Toyota had essentially rebuilt the idea of hierarchy from the bottom up. Now, it doesn't mean that the people at the top aren't ultimately in control. It means that they have gone to immense lengths to understand the extent to which a hierarchy just ends up seeing things from the point of view of the people at the top and in the centre. And the great challenge is to find ways to get the people at the edge of the organisation, at the bottom of the organisation, on the front line, and also beyond the organisation, suppliers and so on, to have a voice and to continually do better once they get that voice. And to be empowered to do so, empowered with power and empowered with information. I won't have a lot of time. Many people will be familiar with some of the ideas that Toyota implemented. The essence here, the critical thing, is that they've built a system in which learning can go upwards. I will again very quickly just show you these stunning productivity graphs from the 60s through till 1992, comparing US automotive productivity and Japanese automotive productivity. Have a look at my slides after the event if you're interested. They really are completely extraordinary. So I think one way to think about the nudge unit approach, behavioural insights approach, is that it is an attempt to address itself to bureaucracies as they are. And of course, one doesn't have any choice. You can come up with a better idea, but if you can't appeal to the people running the bureaucracy, then there's not much point. So nudge units, and I'll talk briefly about what work centres have a similar kind of similar kind of inspiration, which is they are consultancies, so they're very much in the top end of the echelon of the organisation, but they're trying to do work which really should have been done by a competent bureaucracy but isn't being done. And they introduce techniques. Here's an example of A/B testing. So two different letters get experimented with, and you measure which are most successful. What's attractive about this is how scalable it is. And so that becomes a very attractive thing. Here's another example, using feedback to send people text messages before they turn up at the job centre to improve the reliability to get more people doing being part of the program and so on. And what works centres again an attempt to deal with the fact that academia is not very helpful to people trying to do practical things in the world. So in a way, it's trying to drag it out of the scientific paradigm and into a professional paradigm, out of a knowing paradigm and into a doing paradigm. But as you can see from that chart that I put up, the knowledge that comes out of what work centres is very often very decontextualized, and there's a lot of one size fits all about it. Now, again, I'm not being critical. You have to start somewhere, and this seems to me to be a better place to start than lots of universities are at in academia, where their main goal is to get things published in academic journals, and there they sit as if they're a secret, and very few people ever hear about them. I want to show you a different approach, and before I do, I want to take you back to Herbert Simon, because I think there's something else that can be said, which is that sciences address the universe, and I don't want to get anyone too excited, but professions address the multiverse, the human multiverse, because they're about contingent worlds. They're about a world that we seek to build. So that is a pretty powerful way of talking about decontextualized knowledge. If knowledge is decontextualized, its capacity to help us do something in a necessarily very concrete situation is always something to keep in mind. And again, there's that suggested contrast between behavioural science and human-centred design. And Silicon Valley has given us some good lessons here, I think, because Silicon Valley doesn't use a lot of behavioural science. When you're really designing a product from the ground up, human-centered design really became popular because it was seen to be so powerful from Silicon Valley. Behavioural science tends to be tips, tricks that might be useful in a marketing or behaviour change layer. And again, I'm not being critical when I say that, and I'm also being generalising somewhat, and I'd be interested in what people think about that when we get to discussions. So here's some examples of Silicon Valley acing it on human-centered design. This is how Google, one of the reasons why Google ruled the roost in the end, the main reason was it had better technology, but another important reason was that it was very focused on trying to see things from the customer's point of view. Likewise, MySpace filled up with as many ads as Rupert Murdoch could get on the page, and Mark Zuckerberg showed a little more patience on that subject. Here's just a recent quote I came across with an Australian entrepreneur talking about managing technology. The more technology you have, the more the human element is important. I now thought I might talk to you about an ancient Greek word, because it's a very important word. It's a word, I only use this word because we don't have the concept. So in ancient Greek democracy, they had this term isegoria, and it sometimes gets translated as freedom of speech, but it means equality of speech. Think of our own democracy. Think of the fact that less than half the population have university degrees, far less, of course, in the developing world. and the proportion of their elected representatives who have money and education, the two most powerful forms of capital in the world. Now, this is relevant in bureaucracies, it's relevant in social programs, and I wanted to show you a social program. That social program is a program called Family by Family, and I was chairing this thing called the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, and we were given the task of trying to produce a program which prevents an early intervention program which prevents families falling into crisis. And experts have this habit, and they don't necessarily mean it. They're just not thinking that they might not be the centre of knowledge and the centre of the action. So virtually all the programs to address this problem turn out to involve social workers turning up at houses to talk to people, and case management by a professional of a family, and so on. And so what we did at the Australian Centre for Social Innovation was we turned all that around. We didn't exactly, we turned it kind of on its head, but we didn't just say we want to bring a mentor family to help mentor another family. We said we do want it to be a professional program, but we want the professional to be a midwife, not an obstetrician. That is, the professional was a trained family coach that would take the families through the program, the one family mentoring the other. Now, I'm going to take my microphone out, and hopefully we'll get sound on this video, and if we don't, hopefully Prakash will let me know, and I'll just have to press on without it. Are we right?
Family by Family is one of the most inspiring approaches to assisting very vulnerable families going through a tough time, that I've come across in 4 decades.
Lots of people are in that bit where they're trying to get through it and they can't get out the other side, so you can kind of go, you know what, I did this, I've been here, I've done that, I can actually get out. I can help you get out the other side. It can be done. It's not a completely hopeless situation. And I think that's mostly what sharing families have to offer, I think, is just themselves and their stories and their life.
Linda and her family, they were going through a really hard time. They were at risk of having their family separated by having the children removed from the home.
27 notifications in the last 3 years before this year.
What we saw was a very sad, depressed family. There was a lot of confusion happening.
They wanted to take the kids till they were 18. I went through court for 3 months.
How can we help with this? Because we're just as dysfunctional as the next family. But then we realised that we'd actually learned a lot of things that that we could really help Linda with.
Michelle and David have just coaxed me along, and fantastic to go through court, having the support behind me and not losing my kids. I'm looking at a happier future with my kids.
I'm Sue. I'm a seeking family. I'm a single parent with 4 children. My 9-year-old son has some special needs. He was too young for it to be labelled, so it got labelled as developmental delays, which is an umbrella thing. Yeah. Since then, I've been knocking on doors and you know, screaming and crying and whatever for help.
We have guest speakers giving us training, for example, from Autism SA. That was particularly significant with Sue because I was able to pass on that information.
Instead of me telling me, no, I'm useless, I'm this, that and the other, I've got someone saying, no, you are a good mum, you do a good job, you know. So it's just, yes, that helps immensely.
Just seeing her come alive, the way that she holds herself compared to the way that she did when I first met her is just, yeah. She actually, you know, stands tall and smiles.
Now life is it's just going to get better. It's as good as it can get for me at the moment, I believe, you know.
Giving us hope of a new way of reaching out to troubled families. drawing on the strengths that exist in other families.
So my system tells me I have about 8 more minutes, so I'll try and get through what I had to talk about. But this is like lots of programs around the world, an extremely promising program. But here's the thing. We are continually, virtually everywhere, there is this idea that we exist in a market, that programs will have innovative programs, we'll pick the ones that work, we'll scale those programs, and they'll replace the other ones. I'd love anyone in the audience to tell me any example. We've been talking like this for 30 years. I'd love anyone in the audience to tell me any example of that having happened. And essentially what we've got is an approach where some words are said which please us, which imply we're in a kind of market for services, but we're not. We don't build such a market, and we end up with some, that's a favorite image of mine lately, because it seems to me to sum up the idea of design, the scientific idea of design. This was, as you may know, Leonardo da Vinci's first idea for an aeroplane. It was a pretty good one. It just needs a lot of work. He was essentially right, but it needs a great deal of additional design work. So the issue is, right now, we have no mechanism for doing this. We talk about it, but nothing happens. And I could explain a little more about that. And if you're interested, make contact with me after the event, but I don't have time to go into that now. What I do want to say is that I want to tell you what system innovation, what success would look like. It would involve system innovation, this precise thing of new programs scaling and displacing old ones. And it would involve, instead of people at the top being rewarded for sucking knowledge out of the edges of the organization and the community and projecting it back to them, it would actually involve the doers in the community where the knowledge is being identified, where things are happening that are exciting, that being identified, rewarded, empowered, and so on. So let me conclude by telling you what I think a real well-being budget would look like. Remember this themed budget. I think of this as rather like theming a ball. You know, we're going to get people to dress as pirates or in togas or whatever. This is governance by word association, by abstract nouns. You identify some things. Now, those things look to me like some of them look to me like they're quite closely associated with well-being, but there's no sense in which these themes convince us that New Zealand is deploying the instrumentalities of government as effectively as possible to drive up, to discover low well-being and to repair it, to drive up well-being. What would be the first thing it might look like if you did is that it might rather look like a cost curve in greenhouse gases. So here you'll see this is a cost curve which explains the various costs of taking action on reducing emissions, and quite a few of the things don't cost you anything, they save you money. So so what we would be presumably trying to do something similar with well-being. What we have done is we spend our time in academic debates about how we're going to define well-being, but we know enough to start without doing that, because we know enough to identify very clearly where there is low well-being. And then the next question is, how straightforward would it be, how easy would it be to lift that well-being? And in measuring well-being, the dashboard is a very general dashboard. It's great for the news, it's great for the politicians, but it isn't helping the people running programs to optimize their strategy, and it's not helping us work out which programs are responsible for improving well-being. So just to give you some examples on these are off the top of my head, if we're looking for low-hanging fruit, the lowest hanging fruit is that if your boss is no good, you're miserable and you do a lousy job. Now, in fact, the problem there is how do we get better bosses? I do have some ideas on that, but I don't have time to tell you. But again, I can follow up after the event. This is a simpler one, which is that carers have low well-being, and a lot of that low well-being is driven by social isolation. I'm suggesting to you that that's low on the cost curve and quite possibly going to generate negative costs when you take into account hospital costs and so on. This is dyslexia. I think there's a good chance that we could do this a lot better, that we could educate the dyslexic a lot better, and there's a lot of dyslexic people. Again, the sort of thing we could experiment much more with is peer-to-peer teaching and just generally taking the thing more seriously and measuring success and having accountability for that. And early childhood intervention is a classic. Huge economic and well-being gains from doing that. So if we want to move from knowing what, so the essence of this, the essence of know-how is to move not just from knowing what to knowing how, but to build a system of knowing for, knowing in order to improve well-being. So we would measure what works in situ within programs. We would come up with provisional definitions of well-being. This is generally self-reported well-being. You produce a standard for that and you ask people in programs before and after they receive the service to self-report their well-being, and you do that in an ongoing way. You work out what works and what doesn't work. This gives you social proof for the community. I think this is the sort of thing that would be far more in the interests of Jacinda Ardern than some branding, which is essentially what she's got going on now, and would help the programs that work survive a change of government when the change of government, as you know, these days is a rebranding. So those are the kinds of things I'd like to see. And in place of the themed wellbeing budget, I'd be wanting to look at individual programs. I've tried to give you a bit of a sense of that here. That's the one, that's a picture of the boss from the earlier slide, and those little green dots around it would be all the data we were collecting on the impact of our programs on well-being. We already know what they cost. We've already got the other data, but we don't have well-being data. There's the dyslexia program. There might be 10 different experimental trials, and we find out which ones work, and we start using that data to drive improvement, and so on and so on. So there's the slide I gave you about success. How do you hold a system's feet to the fire here? The best I can come up with, but I think it's quite a powerful thing, is to have annual reports of an Auditor General saying where are the pilot programs, which ones are being scaled, because fairly quickly this will become a talking point for the political class. Why do we keep talking about scaling programs that work when we don't scale any programs and we just stay with what we've got, with lots of little pilot programs so we can all talk about innovation? So that's, now I've got to the end of my presentation in 30 seconds too long. I'm quite proud of myself for having done that in the circumstances, and I'm very happy to hear people's questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Nicholas. That was fantastic. We also got lucky because Mark out there found that video of the mask that we could not hear the audio of.
Aha.
He kindly shared it with us on LinkedIn, so we quickly shared it on LinkedIn.
So it wasn't too bad.
Oh no, it is fantastic. People heard it, and people are going to take a look at it, and also on YouTube. So those are fine. We have a couple of questions. Let's take them up. We have around 8-9 minutes, so I think we should be good, right? The first of this question is from Abhijay Nair, and he says, how do this well-being framework enable better cognitive bandwidth for the marginalized without increasing their bandwidth? No policy would achieve its well-being objectives, is what I think.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. But what you're asking these people, the people, the marginalised, you're asking them a very simple question. According to the kind of thing that I'm talking about, you say to them before the delivery of whatever service you're delivering, assess what you think of your life from 1 to 10. They tell you, you deliver a service, and then you find out with the people you've delivered it to how they assess their well-being. In the same way, they may assess their well-being as having gone up, which is relevant, or having stayed the same, or having gone down. They're all relevant. There will be other considerations because many of these programs are trying to improve literacy or whatever. So if you use the sort of mechanism I'm talking about, I think it can be helpful because it is giving some voice to the marginalised. Now, the other way of looking at this is to say that you will be having, if you have programs that work for the marginalised, you run those programs, you attach something like what I've spoken about to the program, and then people tell you, yes, this works for me, and this system that I've got bossing me around with bureaucrats doesn't work for me. So it's not nirvana, but that seems to me to deliver something more likely to be a learning system than the traditional bureaucratic methods that we use at the moment.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Mark. Mark actually was the one who found that video for us and shared with all of us. Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
All right, Mark, brother, here's a question. Mark's question is, if well-being budget is a good idea and the public would benefit, what really is preventing the application? What is really preventing application of it?
Ideas. Really, I mean, what's happened at the moment is we have Jacinda Ardern has shown us that it sells at a PR level, gets you invitations to the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. Everyone's interested in it. What's then holding it back is that you're doing things differently. Now, doing things differently, that's not as hard. If you're a Democratic politician, putting through tax changes is much harder than this. But the thing about this is that it's very institutionally rich. There's lots of people around. There's lots of social workers who are doing what they're doing. And so if you come up with a way of doing a better job, at the moment, there are no level playing fields on which different programs are measured. And so the weight of professional inertia, the weight of professional opinion, the difficulty democratic politicians have in taking something away from someone and giving it to someone else, often within the bureaucracy, it's too hard. So those are the kinds of things. But it's really important for me to point out that politicians do more difficult things than that if their populations want them to, ultimately, if there is a consensus that they should. But here there's really just confusion and lots of people with slogans and nothing much happens.
Right. Here is another question, and it is from Martina. Martina says, can experimentation, especially in the field, be an antidote to scientism, and does it reinforce the tendency to know for the sake of knowing? Or does it reinforce the tendency to know for the sake of knowing? All right.
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. So a lot of nudge units, this is true of the Australian Federal Nudge Unit, a lot of nudge units, they're quite proud of having high-level university graduates in them. And there's a great craze for randomised controlled trials. Now, randomised controlled trials are important and worthwhile, but they give you a single answer. I've got a nice slide showing you the difference between approaches like program logic, which try to break down the logic of a program and test each individual bit of a program to see what's working and what's not, with a randomized controlled trial, which simply says, we did this here, we did it in a randomized way, so we've got a control group over here, it had this effect. Well, the problem with that is, what if you want to vary one element here, or you want to do it in another city or something like that? You don't know the answers to those questions. So randomizing, as I hope people appreciate, I was not speaking against science. I was speaking about keeping clear in one's mind that science is about the universe and the professions are about the multiverse, that professions are about the world we're trying to build. And so an RCT gives you high-powered knowledge, which is very deep, pretty deep contextualized. If you would need that knowledge, that's good. But an awful lot of building a better world will be about using other kinds of knowledge. So if we get ourselves too fanged up with all the graduates who want to do RCTs, not least because they can then get them published, then that actually will look like it's making progress. It'll be easy to report on the news and to report to the minister and to go on the dashboard, but it actually won't build a better world very much.
Thank you for that. This whole, and I remember when we spoke, you helped me understand science as a tool to understand the universe and the world around us versus the profession as the way to implement or use the knowledge to get something done.
Yep.
It was pretty eye-opening, and it would be lovely to go into an entire discussion on that, probably for an hour. However, in the interest of time, let me get back to the next question out here. This is from Nam N. And Nam says, I would be interested to know how Professor Gruen sees the role of behavioral sciences in policy evolving over the next decade.
Well, I think that the role of behavioural sciences is obviously, like any science, it's an important and worthwhile science. I have a preference or something that is done less, it's taught less and it's done much less. I call it paying attention. So one of the slides you didn't see that I sort of edited out for economy of presentation is a slide I often use when I'm presenting to public servants, where I say, when you came out of university, you thought that if you're an economist, in fact, this is a slide I presented to economists, you think that being an economist is 80% your training and 20% fitting your training to the world. I think it's around the other way. Your training gives you certain basic concepts, basic ideas, and you need to pay attention to the way those ideas are being used. Often there's a kind of dominant way, which is just which is just the way everyone is thinking. And if you pay attention, you can often uncover low-hanging fruit. And hopefully I've given you a small example of that. Prakash is saying that this idea of the distinction between sciences and professions was a new one to him. Gee, that's something, isn't it? I think it's a new one to a lot of people, but it's a pretty powerful idea, and it's not from behavioural science. So science is this highly publishable conquest of knowledge in the world, and these other things are about human activity. And by paying attention to what we're doing, I think we can uncover all kinds of things, all kinds of assumptions that we're making that are really holding us back.
Thank you, Professor Gruen. We would love to keep on talking the entire day, but we do have a schedule to keep up with, and our apologies for that. Thank you for joining us in here and helping us with your time and your insights. And on behalf of all our audiences from all over the world, I thank you. Folks who can hear me, I have put down Professor Gruen's LinkedIn profile out there. If you have any more questions, I'm taking the liberty of saying, please feel free to add him up and ask your questions. If you're lucky, he will find some time out of his really busy schedule. And
you can DM me. You can DM me on Twitter on ngruen digit1 anytime you like.
Thank you so much.